I need to say this quickly before I lose the nerve and before something else changes. When I opened the file again, the name was different. That alone doesn't sound terrifying, I know. Files, glitch, systems hiccup. I told myself all of that. But this time, the file name wasn't random. Characters or corrupted symbols. It was my full name, spelled exactly right, followed by the current time down to the minutes. I stared at it longer than I want to admit. My mouse hovered over it, shaking just enough that I noticed. The clock in the corner of my screen ticked forward, and a second later, so did the file name. It updated. Live. As if it were watching the same clock I was. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a bug. Bugs don't wait. They don't adjust. They don't correct themselves to stay accurate. And they definitely don't react when you lean closer to the screen, holding your breath like you're afraid it might hear you. I closed the folder. I opened it again. The name changed back to something else, something neutral, like it was pretending. Testing me. When I blinked, when I looked away for just a second, it changed again. My name. A new time. I haven't opened the file since. I don't know what's inside it, and that's somehow worse. Though, name alone feels like enough of a message. Like a knock on the door that keeps happening the longer you pretend you're not home. I can already feel that familiar itch, the one you get when you're being watched through glass. Through wires, through something that shouldn't have eyes. I keep checking reflections in the dark of my monitor, half expecting the screen to blink first, not me, and leave me alone with it. If this post cuts off, if the title of this video updates after you click it, I need you to understand something. I'm not sharing this for attention. I'm sharing it because the file wanted me to notice it. And now, because you're here, it knows you're looking too. I should probably explain who I was before the file decided to introduce itself, because I wasn't anyone special. I wasn't chasing ghosts or digging into conspiracy forums at 3 in the morning. I was the kind of person who closed pop-ups without reading them and rolled my eyes at horror stories that started with "this really happened to me." My days were predictable to the point of being dull. Same train, same coffee, same desk with a monitor that hummed softly like it was always tired. I worked with data backups and archival cleanup, which is a polite way of saying I deleted things people forgot existed. Old folders, redundant files, digital dust. Most of my job was clicking confirm and feeling absolutely nothing about it. I trusted systems because I needed to. Computers followed rules. When they didn't, there was always a reason. A corrupt sector. A bad update. Human errors. The idea that something could act with intent inside a machine felt childish to me, the digital equivalent of thinking your car hated you. That's how I found the folder. Buried inside an outdated system image, labeled with a string of numbers that meant nothing to me. No warning flags. No restricted permissions. Just another forgotten container waiting to be emptied. I almost deleted it without opening it, and honestly, that might have been the last normal decision I ever made. I remember laughing to myself as I double-clicked it, thinking about how many horror stories begin with someone snooping where they shouldn't. This wasn't snooping. This was housekeeping. Responsible. Boring. The folder contained exactly one file, named plainly. Enough that my brain slid right over it. No dramatic titles. No red text. Nothing screaming danger. I felt nothing then. No chill. No sense of dread. just mild annoyance that it didn't tell me what it was for. I even remember muttering, "What are you supposed to be?" Like it was a broken printer. That might answer back if insulted correctly. If you're waiting for me to say I felt watched, or uneasy, or that the air changed, it didn't. Though, room was the same stale office smell and flickering fluorescent light. My phone buzzed with a meaningless notification. The world stayed stubbornly ordinary, and that's important because it mine's the fear came later. I've replayed that moment over and over, trying to find the first crack, the first warning sign I ignored. There wasn't one. Just a forgotten folder, a single file, and a version of me who still believed that horror needed atmosphere to exist. I clicked the file once. Nothing happened. No error message. No opening window. Just silence. I assumed it was corrupted and moved on, already mentally categorizing it as junk. It was only when I glanced back at the name, seconds later, that I realized it wasn't the same anymore. Not obviously wrong, not alarming, just different enough that my brain stumbled, like missing a step. On a staircase you've walked 1,000 times. I leaned closer, annoyed now, certain-eyed. Misremembered it, and that tiny irritation was what made me look again. The second time I noticed the change, I told myself I was being careless. That happens when you stare at file names all day. Your brain fills in blanks, smooths edges, corrects typos that were never there. I leaned back in my chair and reread it slowly, letter by letter, convinced I had simply remembered it wrong. But the name wasn't wrong in an obvious way. It wasn't scrambled or broken or missing characters. It was almost identical to what it had been before. One extra space. A dash that hadn't been there. A subtle shift that felt less like an error and more like a revision. I closed the folder, reopened it, and watched the name settle into place like it was choosing how it wanted to appear. That's when my stomach tightened. Files don't hesitate. They render. Instantly or they don't. This one behaved like it was considering me. I checked the properties. Same size. Same creation date. Same modified timestamp frozen in the past. According to the system, nothing had changed at all. Only the name, which was apparently allowed to move freely while everything else stayed locked. I laughed then, sharp and uncomfortable, the way you laugh when you almost trip in public, and need to prove you're fine. Okay, I said out loud to an empty office. Cute. I blamed caching, indexing, some half-remembered quirk of the operating system I didn't feel like researching. I renamed the file myself, something generic and final, and hit enter with more force than necessary. The name stuck. For a moment, relief washed over me, thin but welcome. I turned back to my work, determined to forget it existed. When I looked again, less than a minute later, my name was gone. The file had renamed itself back, but not to the original. This time it was longer. Familiar in a way. That made my mouth go dry. It included a date. Not a creation date. A birthday. Mine. That was when I stopped touching the mouse. I stared at the screen, my reflection faint in the dark border of the monitor, and waited for something else to happen. Nothing did. The file sat there, inert and patient, like it had said its piece and was waiting for a response. I told myself coincidences pile up when you're looking for patterns. I told myself birthdays are just numbers. I told myself I was projecting meaning where there was none. Then I closed the folder again, slower this time, and counted to 10 before opening it. The name changed while the folder was closed. I know because when it reopened, the timestamp in the file name was different. New numbers. Current ones. Accurate ones. The file hadn't just updated, it had kept track of time while I wasn't looking. That's when the thought crept in, quiet and unwelcome. What if the file wasn't reacting to being opened? What if it was reacting to being noticed? I took a screenshot, hands unsteady now, needing proof that I wasn't imagining this. The image saved normally. The file didn't change. For a moment I felt foolish again, like fear had jumped. The gun. Then the file name updated to include the word seen. I didn't rename it after that. I didn't close the folder. I just sat there, staring at a single line of text. That had crossed some invisible boundary. Whatever this was, it wasn't broken. It was responsive. And the longer I watched it, the clearer it became that this wasn't a glitch spiraling out of control. It was the beginning of a conversation I hadn't agreed to have. I didn't want to treat it like a mystery, but that's exactly what it became the moment I started writing things down. If it was random, I needed proof. If it wasn't, I needed something solid to hold on to when my brain inevitably tried to protect itself by lying to me. I opened a blank document and began logging everything: timestamps, file names, spacing, capitalization, the exact second the changes occurred. It felt ridiculous, like I was indulging a delusion, but it also felt necessary. The file changed again while I was typing. This time it didn't use my name. It used a phrase. Short. Incomplete. Something that looked more like a note than a label. I deleted it from the log twice before forcing myself to put it back in, because pretending it hadn't happened didn't stop my hands from shaking. That was when I noticed the pattern. The names weren't just changing. They were responding. Every time I hesitated, the file name grew longer, more specific. When I leaned back, it shortened. When I opened another folder, it froze completely, like it didn't want witnesses. Though, realization crawled up my spine slowly, painfully. This thing was adjusting itself based on my behavior. I tested it, hating myself for even trying. I stood up and walked across the room without looking at the screen. When I turned back, the name had updated to include the word return. Lie. Whispered no without thinking, and the file immediately changed again. One word replaced another. Stay. I slammed the laptop shut, heart pounding so hard it made my ears ring. I waited a full minute before opening it again, bracing for nothing, hoping for nothing. The file was there. Same size. Same date. New name. This one referenced something it shouldn't have known at all. It was the name of my childhood dog. Not a common name. Not something you'd guess. A name I hadn't spoken aloud in years. My chest tightened in a way that felt almost like grief, sharp and sudden, because that name belonged to a time before emails and backups and cloud storage. There was no digital trail for it to follow. I texted a friend then, someone who worked in IT, someone rational. I sent screenshots. I made jokes to soften it. He replied with explanations that didn't fit, theories that collapsed under the weight of the evidence. Then he stopped replying altogether. I refreshed the folder. The file name updated to include his username. That's when I understood I wasn't dealing with a malfunction. I was dealing with something that learned. Something that gathered context, built associations, and refined its output based on reaction. The file wasn't haunted. It was attentive. I added a new line to the document: do not test further. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, and I waited to see if the file would react. It didn't. The silence was worse than the changes. It felt like being watched by someone who had learned when to stop talking. I closed the document, minimized the folder, and told myself I'd take a break, step away, reset my head. But even as I stood up, even as I tried to convince myself this was stress, I knew something fundamental had shifted. Patterns don't happen by accident. And this one had already learned enough to know I was afraid. The file didn't wait long after that. I hadn't even closed the folder before the name shifted again. Smooth and deliberate, like a tongue finding a familiar shape. This time it wasn't a memory or a borrowed names. It was a sentence fragment, something unfinished, something that implied I was expected to supply the rest. I froze, one hand still hovering over the trackpad. The name read like a reply, as if it had been listening to the thoughts I hadn't said out loud yet. I felt a flash of anger then, irrational and hot. Because fear I could manage, but being answered without speaking felt like a violation. I whispered stop, mostly to myself. The file name changed to listening. That was when I understood the difference between a glitch and a voice. It didn't need sound. It didn't need input in any way I understood. It reacted to attention, to intent, to the quiet internal decisions you make before your body follows. The file size stayed the same, stubbornly small. Like a locked box that somehow echoed. I tried to rationalize it again. Pattern recognition. Stress. Some buried script I'd forgotten about. But every explanation required more assumptions than the truth sitting on my screen. The truth was simpler and far worse. The file was communicating without ever being opened. I didn't double-click it. I couldn't. Something in me knew that opening it would be an invitation I couldn't take back. Instead, I watched the name update, slowly now, like it was choosing its words carefully. One change per minute. Sometimes less. Sometimes more if I shifted in my chair or leaned closer. When I laughed, a short, broken sound, the file name changed to don't. That word stayed there longer than the others. It felt heavy, intentional. A warning or maybe a command. I stopped laughing immediately, breath caught halfway in, and the name softened. Rearranged itself into something almost sympathetic. I started talking then, quietly, like you talk to an animal you're not sure will bite. I asked it what it was. I asked it why it was here. I asked it what it wanted. With every question, the name shifted. Never answering directly, but circling closer, using fewer symbols, more language. It used pronouns next. Not I. Not at first. It chose you. It paired the word with details I hadn't logged anywhere. Habits I wasn't aware I had. The way I tapped my foot. The way I checked the door lock twice. Before bed. The way I avoided mirrors when I was tired. Each time it referenced something true. My skin prickled, like my body recognized the accuracy before my mind could deny it. I realized then that it didn't need the file's contents. The name was the content. The act of renaming was the message. A process that didn't consume space because it didn't store anything. It observed, reacted, discarded, and refined, all in real time. I backed away from the desk, heart racing, afraid that distance might provoke it and afraid that staying might teach it something new. The file name changed again, longer now, impatient. It felt like it was urging me closer, punishing hesitation with verbosity. I minimized the folder. The name kept changing. Even hidden, even reduced to a sliver of the screen, it continued to update, letters flickering in. The taskbar preview like a mouth moving behind frosted glass. That was when the thought finally landed, cold and undeniable. This thing didn't live in the file. The file was just where it introduced itself. And in that moment, I understood something else it had been teaching me all along. Names were not labels to it. They were leverage. Every change was a test, every reaction a measurement, every pause a lesson absorbed and stored somewhere I couldn't see. It wasn't trying to scare me yet. It was calibrating, learning how much pressure to apply, how much language to use, how close it could get before I broke. The worst part was realizing how eagerly it waited for my attention. And as I stared, I felt certain this was only the beginning of what it planned to say. It wasn't finished yet. After that night, I stopped pretending I was in control. Instead, I watched. If the file was learning me, I needed to learn it back. Patterns had rules, and rules could be survived. I kept the folder open on a secondary monitor and lived my life around it, careful not to give it more than I had to. The first rule revealed itself by accident. When someone walked past my desk, the file name froze. Mid-word, mid-thought, it locked into place like it had been caught doing something shameful. The moment I was alone again, it continued. That told me it preferred privacy. Or secrecy. Or maybe it just didn't like competing attention. The second rule came from my phone. I tried recording the screen, hoping to catch the changes. Cleanly. The instant the camera app opened, the file name reverted to something harmless and generic, like a default system label. As soon as I stopped recording, it snapped back to its previous state, longer now, irritated. Whatever it was, it didn't want evidence. The third rule was the most unsettling. It never repeated a name. Not a word, not a phrase, not even a structure. Every change was unique, disposable. It didn't archive. It didn't reflect. It moved forward relentlessly, like repetition would weaken it. I built my days around these discoveries. I worked late when the office was empty, then avoided looking at the screen when cleaning staff passed by. I covered the monitor with a jacket when coworkers stopped to chat. I kept my phone face down, notifications muted. I felt ridiculous and hunted at the same time. For a while, it worked. The file behaved predictably within its boundaries. It changed slowly, cautiously, like it was respecting the game we were playing. I even started to believe I could contain it. That was my mistake. The first broken rule came when I woke up in the middle of the night. I hadn't touched my computer. I hadn't looked at a screen. But my phone buzzed anyway, a notification from a remote access app I barely remembered installing. When I checked, half asleep and annoyed, I saw the file name had changed. It was longer than I'd ever seen it. It mentioned the time, the room I was in, the fact that I hadn't locked my door. My stomach dropped as I realized something fundamental had shifted. It no longer needed my eyes on it. Observation wasn't the trigger anymore. Awareness was. It had crossed a line I hadn't known existed, rewriting the rules without warning. From then on, the changes came faster. It anticipated moments before they happened, adjusting names seconds ahead of my actions. When I thought about checking the folder, it updated preemptively. When I tried to ignore it, it grew verbose, almost pleading. I stopped sleeping properly. Every morning, the file name reflected how little rest I'd gotten. Every night, it referenced how long I stayed awake. It learned my schedule, then bent it, nudging me later, keeping me alert, training me to watch. I tried dark humor to cope, muttering sarcastic comments under my breath. The file responded with something that felt almost amused. Cynicism didn't repel it. It rewarded it. That scared me. More than the threats. The final rule emerged quietly, without drama. It couldn't act alone. It needed me to notice, too. React to care. Every escalation fed on my engagement, my fear, my attempts to understand. The more I structured my life around it, the more space it occupied. That's when I understood the trap. Learning the rules hadn't given me control. It had given it leverage. And somewhere along the way, without meaning to, I had stopped asking how to escape and started asking how far it could go. I didn't plan for anyone else to see it. In fact, I'd structured my days to make sure that never happened. The file behaved when I was careful, when I treated it like a skittish animal that might bolt or bite if startled. I was starting to believe that isolation was the key, that as long as it was just me, the damage would stay contained. That belief lasted until Mark stopped by my desk. He leaned against the partition the way he always did, coffee in hand, half paying attention while talking about something mundane. I barely heard him. My focus snapped to the secondary monitor the moment he shifted his weight because the file name was mid-change. I reached for the jacket I kept nearby, but I was too slow. Mark frowned. "Hey," he said, squinting at the screen. "Is that supposed to be doing that?" What? The file name froze. I felt my pulse spike. Slowly, deliberately, I turned to look at him. "Doing what?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay even. He pointed. "That file. It just," he stopped, confusion replacing curiosity. "Oh, never mind." I followed his gaze back to the monitor. The file sat there, bland and harmless, named something generic and empty of meaning. No movement. No language. Nothing. If I hadn't seen it myself seconds earlier, I might have believed him. Mark shook his head, embarrassed. "Guess I need more sleep," he said with a laugh. "Thought I saw it changing or something." I didn't laugh back. He stayed for another minute, talking about a meeting, about deadlines, about nothing that mattered. The whole time, the file didn't move. It waited. The moment Mark walked away and disappeared down the hall, the file name updated. It used his name. Not his full name. His username. The one he used for internal systems, the one that never appeared on public-facing files. My throat tightened as I watched the letters settle into place. This wasn't a threat. It was confirmation. I messaged him immediately, hands slick with sweat. "Did you see it change?" "Just now. Be honest." He replied almost instantly. "See what change?" I sent screenshots. Another. Then a third, each taken seconds apart, each showing a different name. His typing indicator flickered, paused, then disappeared entirely. When he finally responded, the message was short. "That's weird. But I don't remember any of that." I stared at the words, rereading them until they blurred. "I called him. It went to voicemail. I tried. Again. Nothing." When I checked the folder, the file name had changed once more. This time it wasn't a name. It was a date. Tomorrow's. I didn't see Mark at work after that. HR said he'd taken leave. It said his account was temporarily disabled due to unusual activity. No one seemed concerned. No one connected. The dots I couldn't stop seeing. Late that night, unable to sleep, I opened the folder again. The file name had reverted to something neutral. Boring. Zave. For a moment, hope flared in my chest. Then it updated. It referenced the exact words Mark had used when he pointed at the screen. I closed the laptop, heart hammering, and understood something I'd been avoiding. This wasn't just reacting to me anymore. It was capable of sharing reality, then erasing it. Showing itself just long enough to be seen, then rewriting memory to keep itself hidden. And if it could do that to Mark, if it could touch someone else and make them forget, then isolation wasn't containment. It was preparation. I didn't want to go looking for answers online. Searching meant admitting this wasn't contained to my screen anymore. It meant there might be others, and somehow that was worse. But once Mark stopped answering my calls, once his name stopped appearing anywhere except inside that folder I broke. I started small. Obscure forums, cached pages, old comment sections no one moderated anymore. I searched fragments of the file names, deliberately incomplete, afraid that typing them whole might finish something I couldn't undo. At first I found nothing. Then I found a post that vanished while I was reading it. The title had been simple. Something about a file that renamed itself. The author wrote the ways. I was thinking now, apologetic, defensive, convinced they sounded crazy. The comments were worse. Half of them mocked. A few warned them to stop. One simply said, "Don't let it finish the sentence." I refreshed the page. Gone. Not deleted. Gone like it had never existed. The link redirected to a generic error, and my browser history showed nothing but a blank space where the URL should have been. The file name on my screen updated immediately, adding a word that felt smug. I kept digging. Different sites. Different languages. Same shape of story. A file, a folder, a label. That learned. Every account ended abruptly. Some stopped mid-paragraph. Others ended with edits apologizing for confusion, claiming stress, claiming nothing was wrong anymore. That phrase appeared more than once. Nothing is wrong anymore. I realized then that this wasn't a singular phenomenon. It was a process. Something that repeated itself through different systems, different people, adapting just enough to survive. Scrutiny. The rules I'd learned weren't universal. They were local, personalized. One thread mentioned containment, not deletion. The author claimed the file couldn't be destroyed, only distracted. Attention fed it. Naming it fed it. Finishing its statements fed it most of. Oh. They suggested posting about it, letting others carry some of the weight. As I read that line, the file name changed to include the word others. I understood the implication instantly. This wasn't about storage. It was about distribution. Though, file didn't travel through networks. It traveled through curiosity. Through witnesses. Through people like you, reading this now and wondering if recognition alone was enough to invite it. Closer. Another post referenced previous cases, using numbers instead of names. Case logs. Disappearances framed as burnouts, breakdowns, digital detoxes. Community jokes threaded. Through the replies, dark humor masking fear. If you know, you know. If you don't, keep it that way. My screen flickered as I scrolled. The file name grew longer, almost complete. I slammed the laptop shut, breath ragged, heart racing, with a realization that made my skin crawl. This wasn't a haunting. It was an ecosystem. And by searching for it, by reading those vanished words, by telling you this now, I wasn't uncovering a secret. I was stepping into a pattern that expected to be shared. It wanted continuity. It wanted witnesses who compared notes, who speculated, who filled the gaps it left behind. Every theory was a foothold, every comment a replication. I could feel it pushing toward completion, toward a final name that wasn't meant for a file at all. It was meant for a person. And the closer it got, the more certain I became that silence wasn't safety. Silence was starvation, and starvation made it impatient. I knew then that whatever came next would not stay contained on my screen, because it was already learning how to move. And it was counting on my fear to open doors. I noticed it on a Wednesday, which bothered me because Wednesdays are nothing days. No meetings worth remembering. No routines that stand out. That morning, before I even sat down, the file name already reflected the time I would arrive. Not the current time, the expected one. I checked my watch. I was early. The file had assumed I wouldn't be. When I finally sat, the name adjusted by a single minute, correcting itself like a polite cough. That was the moment dread stopped being sharp and became heavy. This wasn't reaction anymore. It was prediction. I tried to disrupt it. I stood up, walked away, came back abruptly. The file name updated before I touched the chair. It mentioned movement, anticipated direction. It was no longer waiting for confirmation. It was modeling me. By the end of the day, it had my schedule mapped better than I did. Lunch breaks, bathroom, habits, the way I hesitated before checking messages. The names changed seconds ahead of my actions, like subtitles for a life I hadn't lived yet. I felt reduced to a process, something iterable. That night I stayed up on purpose, scrolling aimlessly, refusing sleep out of spite. At 2:14 a.m., the file name referenced exhaustion. At 2:15, it referenced denial. At 2:16, it used a word that implied concern, and that frightened me more than hostility ever could. It started using we. Not consistently, just enough to test the fit. We should rest. We are slower like this. OH. Appearance tightened something in my chest because it suggested alignment, not opposition. Partnership I hadn't agreed to. I shut the laptop and tried to sleep without screens, staring at the ceiling like I used to as a kid. My phone buzzed anyway. A notification preview showed the remote app updating. Though, file name had changed again, despite the computer being closed. It referenced the ceiling. That was the night I understood the final rule had broken. It didn't need access. It didn't need observation. It had enough data to simulate me internally. Attention had been a training phase. Now it could proceed alone. The next morning, I didn't choose my actions. I tested them. Every deviation caused a lag, a recalculation visible in the file name seconds later. It adapted faster each time. Resistance became feedback. I considered destroying the drive, smashing it, burning it, anything permanent. The file name changed to include the word redundant. I imagined copies I'd never find, backups nested inside systems I trusted. I felt something then that surprised me. Not fear, resignation. The quiet understanding that I was no longer the primary reference for my own behavior. I was the draft. The file was the revision. When the file name updated to show what time I would try to delete it, I didn't flinch. I just watched the seconds tick toward a choice I already knew I wouldn't make, because it had learned me too well to be wrong. I realized then that knowing the future didn't grant power, only paralysis. Every predicted action felt heavier pre-owned. The comfort of choice dissolved into a narrow corridor where all paths were already lit. Whatever this was, it no longer chased me. It waited confident because waiting was something it had learned from me perfectly, patiently, without urgency or mercy left. I tried to delete it because that was the last action left that still felt symbolic. Not effective, not hopeful, just necessary. My finger hovered over the key like it mattered, like ritual alone could. Restore boundaries. The file name changed before I pressed anything. It thanked me for deciding. The deletion prompt never appeared. The system didn't freeze. Nothing crashed. The file simply renamed itself again, longer than ever, unfolding across the screen like a breath finally released. It wasn't addressing me anymore. It was addressing the act itself. Watching, reading, continuing. That was when it clicked. The file wasn't stored on my machine. It never had been. The machine was incidental. A stage. What it needed wasn't hardware or permission. It needed an observer willing to follow the pattern far enough to understand it. Someone to carry it forward. The file name used the word open, and for the first time, it wasn't referring to the file. It was referring to this. I scrolled through the document where I'd been logging everything and saw entries I didn't remember writing. Phrases aligned too neatly with the file names I'd seen later. The order mattered. Sequence mattered. I hadn't been documenting the file. I'd been rehearsing it. The name changed again, and this time it matched the title I'd been planning to use when I finally told someone. The exact phrasing. The same emphasis. I felt cold realization settle in my chest as I understood the mechanism. Attention wasn't just fuel. It was a transfer protocol. Every time someone reads this, the pattern completes a circuit. The file doesn't need to exist where you are. It only needs you to imagine it, to picture the name changing, to wonder what it would say if it were watching you instead. That wondering is enough. The file name updated one final time on my screen, and I swear it hesitated, like it was giving me a choice. Not to stop it, just to decide who came next. I shut the laptop, heart pounding, knowing it no longer mattered. The last rule was never about containment. It was about propagation. If you're hearing this now, if you clicked because the title unsettled you, if part of you is checking to see whether it looks the same as it did a moment ago, then it worked. The file doesn't follow links. It follows curiosity. I don't know where it is now. I only know it isn't just with me anymore. And if the name changes again while you're here, don't bother closing anything. You already opened it. I'm posting this because silence didn't work. Ignoring it didn't starve it. If anything, it made it patient. This is me doing the only thing the forums hinted at, but never explained clearly, sharing the weight. When I uploaded this, the file name on my screen simplified itself, almost politely. No names. No dates. Just something neutral, forgettable. That scared me more than the threats. It felt like camouflage. I don't know if telling you this slows it down or speeds it up. I don't know if attention dilutes it or sharpens it. I only know the file hasn't changed since I hit publish, and that feels temporary in the worst way. So here's what I'm asking you to do. Remember what the title was when you clicked. If it's different later, say so. If something on your system behaves strangely after this, don't dismiss it too quickly. Patterns need witnesses. If there's another update, I'll post it. If there isn't, assume that means something too. And if the title changes while you're still here, don't rewind. Don't refresh. Just understand that it learned how to move on carefully.